Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Jeanne Allen. I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Education Reform, and I'd like to welcome you to the release of Movement at Risk, a Manifesto, which paves the way for a new agenda for education. Before I begin, I'd like to recognize a group of the Center for Education Reform's Board of Directors, including our chairman, John Hage. If you wouldn't mind standing up, please. CER's Board of Directors represents people from legal, higher education, K-12, preschool, business, and leadership and education. So I'm delighted that they are here. I'm delighted that you are here. Welcome in particular to thought leaders, education leaders, officials from the American Federation of Teachers, from the Alliance for Public Charter Schools, from the Heritage Foundation, and all across the political and ideological spectrum. It is the point of why we're here, and so I'm delighted to have such a robust and diverse group. This is a clarion call. Everyone gathered here today recognizes that we are faced with a wave of domestic and international turmoil. You can't go to a conversation anywhere where someone doesn't actually mention that education or lack of education may just be in part responsible for the trouble we face today. In 1983, A Nation at Risk called on the American public. It was a call to arms. It impressed on the people an urgent need to refocus on the robust education of our nation's youth. Much action ensued, much. Decades later, however, a wave of amnesia has taken hold of American minds. Many people have forgotten or never knew that this report's message, what it was, and why it was so impactful. It was bipartisan, diverse, and it produced a generational commitment to education reform that has endured until now. The members of the National Commission on Excellence in Education did something that many of us can learn from today. They agreed to set aside major disagreements. I remember Dr. Milton Goldberg, the executive director of that commission, sharing with us during a class that we had for young people in the education reform movement that he had some 65 people that were as diverse as Senator Orrin Hatch to then president of the NEA, Mary Hatwood Futrell. They came together with many diverse thoughts, and yet they agreed to put disagreements aside and unify and challenge the nation to do more. The result was a president who traveled around to 51 different meetings, governors who took up the flag and ushered in a bevy of reforms that challenged the status quo. Between 1991 and 2000 alone, 36 laws were enacted governing the creation of new charter schools and 2 creating new full school choice programs in 9 years. The leader of one of those, George Voinovich, died this year, just this week. It reminded me that those who paved the way for action and engagement of a novel kind are all too quickly leaving us and therefore leaving our collective memory. In the education reform movement's earliest days, states enacted their own standards with support, but no mandates from Washington. The states started the first high-stakes testing, initiated merit pay, decentralized education decisions during that period, and the result was the development of movement of thousands of people, organizations, policymakers, pundits engaged with and for education, even when they didn't agree. It was controversy to a good end. By 2008, that unity that forged those efforts and the result were both dwindling. The American people were naturally preoccupied by wars and political battles. But it was as if the terrorist threat of 9/11 didn't just change our way of life externally, but also our ability to unite over important domestic issues. The people who issued A Nation at Risk saw the link between well-educated people and a citizenry that knows how to deal with security and economic stability. We're wondering, do we? Sometimes it takes a tragedy to remind us what's important. That was obvious for the education reform movement post-New Orleans 2005. Hurricane Katrina washed away much of the city's education infrastructure, and in the wake of widespread destruction, the massive exodus of people, the unity of education, education leaders, education reformers, and national spokespeople created a number of autonomous schools to fill the void. It was the closest thing we have to realizing the groundbreaking vision of education innovator Ted Coldry, the pioneer of the original charter school idea. 25 years ago, few imagined that his prescription for creating new responsive schools in the spirit of choice, innovation, diversity would evolve into a nationwide movement. Yet those who are part of the education reform movement, to those who are part of it, I say, if we're to be honest with ourselves, we must acknowledge that today our efforts to drive change, as much as we did in the early days, have hit a wall. The reality is we accomplished more in the first 9 years of the education reform movement than we have in the past 16. There was a time when all of our national leaders embraced the common goal to reform schools. There was a time when Democrats, like presidential frontrunner Hillary Clinton, supported charter schools. There was a time when Republicans were in favor of strong standards. And there was a time when reformers understood the need to hold fast to structural changes in education that empower the real people closest to students, the parents and teachers who gave their careers and their lives to make an impact. All across the country, continual efforts to stifle law, policy, and practice are limiting innovative approaches. And meanwhile, educators and leaders in our traditional system are demanding the same kind of flexibility that many of us once brought to education through charter schools. While most literally of thousands of people we've spoken with over the last few months agree, they think that someone else is covering the work, and yet they say we are not doing enough to unite across the spectrum. The hallmark of education reform and innovation that was sparked by that 1983 Nation at Risk report was to bring in to life new ideas, new innovations, create a laboratory for change that could attack the entire system, that could bring positive changes to all working in education across the country. And that's exactly what began to happen. And we saw things take off. But today, reformers are our own worst enemy. What started out as that agenda to be all-encompassing has somehow turned narrow, hollow, and hostile to the idea and ideals of public education. Our movement has become known more for what it's against than what it advocates for. And it's obscured the original focus, which is kids and families. And this is despite more money, more people working on this, dozens of more groups, and a much larger media footprint that we didn't have, frankly, when we all first started. Even with the Democratic president who strongly supports the charter model and congressional leadership predisposed to choice and innovation, even with more money and muscle behind our movement, we struggle every day to defend what exists and expand what works. And now we're on the cusp of a major, important election, off message, losing ground at the national level, losing fights in communities across the country, and more divided than ever before. We must commit to a new way, a new agenda. Howard Fuller once said we ought to be impatient because we've not made the changes in education we need to make. The movement's soul is not about new school models or pedagogy, standards of technology. It's about our children's lives. And so today, I am pleased to not only share this reality check with you. It is sobering. It is not great news. The great news is there's a room of people here who we believe is committed and who represent literally thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people across the country that are willing and want to make a change, and we want to work with you to help make that change. And so today I've invited 3 people in particular who can help discuss this issue. And I want to start with Governor Engler, the president of the Business Roundtable, a former 3-term governor of Michigan. He embodies the spirit of education reform, but also represents literally millions of people through his companies that recognize the challenges we're facing every day. So Governor Engler, let me start with you. How do you account for our dramatic gains at a time when technology and innovation were barely out of front page, to a time when education reform is failing? How do you account for this early success, and what do we see now, and how do we get to a refocus?
Well, there are a series of questions all wrapped in that little question you've just posed to me, but let me first, Jeanne, just congratulate you on sounding the alarm today and raising the profile of the challenge that's in front of people across America who support education reform and education achievement, which is the purpose of reform. We need high standards and we need high levels of achievement. As president of the Business Roundtable, I work with leading global companies that do business in every corner of the world. Today there's a global competition for talent. We have to be able to win that competition. We've got to be able to compete, and we've got to be able to produce our own talent. And we really need, look at the demographics, everybody to be part of this solution, because today I was this morning releasing an economic report with our chairman, Doug Oberhelm, the CEO, chairman of Caterpillar. he was talking about how much technology is on the smallest machine they make. They make some really big ones and they make some smaller ones, but there's technology infused everywhere. And to operate equipment today, to be in a manufacturing process, to be in an office environment, everybody's using technology and is required to have skills, the ability to think, the ability to collaborate. And if we're going to get this right, we've got to make gains that we haven't been making. And if we think about the industry, if you will, of public education, about a $650 billion annual commitment on the part of the American public, a massive investment. And then we go to the nation's report card, the NAEP scores, 36% reading at the end of the 3rd grade. That's our proficiency score, basically 1 in 3. Folks, we can't make it 1 in 3 reading proficiently. I believe that America can teach its children to read. I believe that ought to be job one, and that's how we get started. So, and Jeanne, when you talk about the sort of the conundrum, we're awash in technology, and yet, as you suggest, some of the results aren't what we would like. Part of this, on the front end, maybe is just will, almost, an organization. And I think that's true today. In 1993, when we were looking at how do we bring choice and competition, I think something gets lost in the coverage. America's always had choice in public education. But until the movement started, and we in Michigan, I followed Ted Kohldrab, governor in Michigan, elected in 1990. We followed what they did in Minnesota. And we were excited and we were intrigued by it. And it was new ground. We had not been there, but we said, this is truly interesting. And the choice that had existed at that time was strictly dependent on one's ability to afford the house in the school district where they wanted their child to go. So for upper income, you talk about an impact of income inequality, upper income citizens always had free choice. Unlimited choice. You could buy your house wherever you wished, and your child could go to that school. What happened in the choice and the charter movement is that we broke those bonds loose. And we said for the first time, you can choose to go to a school other than the one right where you live. You get to pick. And in fact, we're going to have new kinds of public schools. Michigan actually, and I realize there's a voucher debate, and that's an option in some states, but in Michigan, my home state, it was not. Our Constitution prohibited public funds being spent on non-public schools. So this was always and remains a public school debate in Michigan. But we said, what about new kinds of public schools, charter schools, that would be formed by interested parties who cared passionately about education, about children and their accomplishments? And we looked at what had done in Minnesota. And in Michigan, we took a wide open approach and said, let's let chartering be done by lots of people. And for sure, don't restrict the ability to have a charter to the people who are going to face the competition, because it might be human nature that if I could have a world where I don't have competition, I might prefer that over one where I do. So we took the chartering decisions and created that in universities, in other places where competitors could rise up. And today in Michigan, Jim Gunner is here for the National Center, but they're headquartered, I'm proud to say, in my hometown of Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And we probably have, 200 charter schools in Michigan, Jim? 300. See, it just continues to grow. And now that we are there, we're on the scene. We've seen, and I won't get into all of that because it's in your discussion, but I will just say, when you think about the point you're raising, innovation and opportunity, I think the challenge is there for all types of public schools today. And I think some of the work that Jim's done in particular is on the outcome. And you have a wonderful recommendation. I just want to cite this, and I realize I'm not making a speech here, but it sounds like it. You mentioned benchmarking state assessing to NAEP. Think about that if everybody actually understood how they stood up in relationship to the national report card. Because as I said, I think we can teach America's kids to read. I think that ought to be the next short-term goal. I think in 5 years, we ought to have 90% of those kids reading proficiently. That's all children break it down, all demographic groups. We can do that. We know how to teach children to read. I think it should be 100, but we've missed a lot of our goals in the past, but by golly, why can't we do that? And then I think our odds of learning science and mathematics and all of the other things that today a well-prepared young person is going to need. And I'll just close with, if we get that done, then we can achieve my 3 goals for American public education. They are the following. 1, when a child finishes high school age, they're able to go to college without needing remediation. No more remediation in college. Let's get it right as we're coming up. 2, since not everybody needs to go to college, and today there are marvelous jobs in America that don't require college, but they do require competencies and skills. So you need to get those, and so you need to be, if you're choosing to not go directly to college, and it's America, you can always go back later. You can do it online. You can even do your K-12 education online if you wish. But if you're going to go to the workforce, you should have a skill that's been measured and hopefully assessed along the lines of some standards that are set up by nationally recognized groups. And then 3rd, the dropout rate has to be 0, because the American economy today, unfortunately, just it does not offer opportunities for unskilled people, at least opportunities that they're going to find satisfactory, or they're going to be the kind of opportunities where you can actually build a life and have, I think, the opportunity to take advantage of all that America offers.
Thank you. David Levin is the president and CEO of McGraw-Hill Education. He's responsible for the growth and management of global business. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today, following on Governor Engler's comments, and the punchline that you use, Governor Engler, innovation and opportunity. It's embedded in the manifesto and our recommendations for change. I wanted to get this conversation started, so it's not a surprise. It goes right there. You think about what you always talk about, the trajectory of kids to college, right? Think about what was just said, 3rd grade reading proficiency, the whole notion of trying to get students to college without remedial education. How can innovation actually affect and influence learning outcomes for students, processes, and methods for teachers? And do you see, given that you represent largely a company with great tradition across America's public schools, you've had a generation that we've gone through in 25 years, if you consider this, from the time that these issues first started percolating. What do you see as the difference? What's the trajectory for change? Is it slow? Is it quick? And where can people in this room advocate best to affect teaching and learning?
Jeannie, thank you. And that's an even more complicated set of questions. So first of all, I should just say, you're hearing a different accent. So what's this bloke from Zimbabwe doing talking to you all? And the answer is I'm a recent immigrant, but a very committed one. And somebody who is deeply passionate about how education transforms societies and how important that is. So I just start by thinking that, sometimes the word innovation itself is just used as a panacea. Just let's create change just for the sake of it. And what's interesting is here in the United States, there is the greatest set of innovations that have ever happened around technology. And yet some very basic things that we never talk about when they relate to education. So here's a simple one, which every single person in this room is empowered to go and make a difference with this afternoon. We talk about standards in education. You actually, in the world of technology, we wouldn't have the innovations that we've got without some core foundational standards in technology. Those don't exist in school systems. Those don't exist in higher ed. So what we've got is everybody goes out and builds their own. And the consequence of that you all are living with, which is redundant complexity, systems which don't talk to one another, costs which escalate, and frankly, technology has not delivered to education remotely. And that's in part because it's being taken away from the point at which it touches students and it touches teachers. Actually, technology isn't the answer. Empowering people in education is the answer. Technology should be really good at that, but actually the way it's been implemented, it's frankly laughable. So there, little takeaway for you all, there's a set of standards, IMS Global. The IMS Global Consortia has set up a set of core standards which, if implemented and if put into procurement, would change the role of technology just by saying everything's got to basically work together. So that's just a little simple point on, so we spend a lot of money on buying things which then don't work together. So that's one sort of bucket. Second thing is just understanding some of the terms of the debate. It's fascinating as a foreigner originally to come here and hear discussions around standards and hear the immediate knee-jerk responses that things trigger. But when we back up a bit and you say, actually, look, you want children and young people to aim as high as they possibly can, to achieve as much as they can, the debate's been obscured and twisted. So I think the debate around assessment is particularly toxic. Formative assessment is going to be transformational now that we can put more and more data into schools. We've exited the summative assessment business. We think it's a bit of a nightmare, not only as a business, but the rear view mirror approach on education is a bit of a nightmare of a way of grading schools and assessing progress. I think it should be done, regularly by the day. Is when educational advances are happening in the school day by day. So to me, the sort of short agenda is set up standards, allow for competition, celebrate the fact that you are, and real kudos to you for putting this back on the agenda, because it's just not in the debate that we really need to think about raising standards and making certain that we deliver. Because equity, diversity are incredible assets if harnessed, but at the moment they work against us.
That's so true. And Donald, before I come to you, I have to be mindful of Governor Engler, unfortunately, needs to leave us a little early. He had a commitment before, and I'm grateful you squeezed us in. Donald, it means you get a lot more time to talk in a second. But I just want to, before you leave us, come back to this very point about transformation. Can we learn something from the business community, right? So you represent the Business Roundtable, which is just the creme de la creme of organizations that support and advocate for policies globally. I imagine leadership is diverse. I imagine there are all sorts of different stripes of every flavor, color, political persuasion, and yet you can come together in a room and get stuff done.
We do.
Can you leave us with any kinds of thoughts about how we take that role model and take it to the next level?
I guess it's sort of along the lines of remembering the main thing is the main thing, and that you've got to focus. And it's just like, just take the reading example. There is no excuse that we aren't teaching America's kids to read proficiently by the 3rd grade. We're talking 4 years in a school, and today with the proliferation of preschool programs, it's often 1 or 2 years of that. So it's 4 to 6 years, and 1 in 3 are reading proficiently. Now let me put a context in that. That's the average. Unfortunately, when we take underrepresented minority populations here, we'll find those numbers sky up. In the non-reading, non-proficient number can be as high as 80 and 90%. Sadly, in Detroit, the NAEP score says 5%. And that's why I said it's morally bankrupt to be thinking about how do I put a child in a classroom where 1 in 20 will actually, according to the statistics, read proficiently after that 4 to 6 year period. I mean, if we passed a law and said you're barred from learning to read, we would probably increase performance, because people would be irritated about that and say, wait a minute, how can you stop me from learning to read? And yet we're accepting this. And I think the one thing, there's one analogy you can make. In the private sector, there's a market test on things. Remember the Edsel? Remember New Coke? I mean, a couple of noted failures. I mean, they didn't do so well. The iPhone or Amazon, Netflix, I mean, wow, everybody wants to use. So that's why your transparency part of the, what you call, that's part of both opportunity and innovation. And David just mentioned it sort of in passing here, because today, if we simply use the best of what we know how to do that we're using somewhere and did that everywhere, we would get a quantum leap forward. If we stopped all education research, nobody wrote any more papers at any of our universities about how to do anything better, and just simply concentrated on taking what we're doing well somewhere and did that everywhere, we would lift the performance. That isn't good enough, but that would get us on that path. And so that's one thing business does, is it replicates success and tries to figure out how to beat it. It doesn't start from scratch and say, that's working pretty well, but let's not use any of that. Let's see if we can't invent something new. So there's that piece. And I think the other thing is trying to build, and this is what your conversation that you're launching today, why it's so important, is what does America think is important, and how can we not think education and educational attainment for all groups, for all people in America? I mean, we're a very diverse economy. We'll be even more diverse. That's a strength. We're relatively, and David can speak to this, we're relatively a young country still. The demographics actually work for us, but the demographics reflect a different population than we've had also, and we need everybody. We're going to have massive retirements. There are companies out there where 50% of their workforce are eligible to retire almost now, but certainly in the coming years. Who's going to do these jobs? And so there's 5 to 6 million unfilled jobs in America today, just as we sit here. 5 to 6 million unfilled jobs because people don't have the skills to do the work. Now, shame on us for not giving those skills there. Both candidates, it's a crazy presidential year, but one thing that both candidates have talked about is the need to get busy fixing America's infrastructure. We're all in on that. Well, guess what? Construction industries today, the housing market's been actually coming back a little bit. They're short on workers. All over America where there's housing growth, they're short on construction workers. We get started in infrastructure, we've got nobody to do the work. So that will require a massive job training program. It is hard to train somebody to use technology if they aren't literate. Just saying. We need to fix that. Let's start there. And this is awfully important. That's why, literally, Jeanne mentioned I had to change the schedule in order to come here. But I felt it was so important to try to lend the voice of business, because there's a lot of talk also in the campaigns about the whole question of income inequality. One of the reasons that there is a challenge is training and skills and education. Those gaps lead directly to less opportunity for income. And we got to fix it. I mean, there's no reason, and we know how to do much of this. We already know. We just have to do it, and we have to not accept somebody telling us, well, it'll be 4 years until the principal retires, and we get a new principal, and then we can maybe make a change, or we can't accept somebody saying, well, we're not doing so well, and we're unhappy that these competitors, whether those competitors are a charter school or an online school, or they're something different, but they're taking my students. One of the things we did in Michigan, which I think should be done everywhere in America, is today the money follows the child. That's been true since 1994. If the child leaves the school district this table and goes over to the school district that table, the money goes along with them. And so it's not the case where the child leaves, the money stays behind. No, the money goes with the child, and it should. We can do it. That could even be improved, but fundamentally that ought to be everywhere in America. Jeanne, thanks for remembering.
Thank you so much, Governor Engler. Appreciate it. Please join in. Thank you, Governor Engler. We welcome your partnership. We look forward to continuing to work with you on this path. Thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome.
So finally, we are pleased to welcome Donald Hentz, the original Donald. Should create a Twitter handle, the real Donald Hentz. And as I'm introducing Donald, I'm also going to welcome the great students who are coming in who've been touring the White House from one of the leading charter schools in the country, Democracy Prep. Donald, you've heard a lot from and about business leadership. David Levin, whose work spans services, products, and support for schools. You happen to chair and founded, from an incredible civil rights background, the leading charter school in Washington, D.C., in fact, the largest charter school in the country with many, many multiple campuses. It's an honor to have you. Donald's also a longstanding member of the Center for Education Reform's board. And you've just been a central force. You stood hand in glove with Marion Wright Edelman. You've stood hand in glove as George Bush visited your school. You represent someone who transcends those kinds of differences. You practice unity, conquered much inequity in Wards 7 and 8 in this city and other cities like Baton Rouge and Baltimore. How and what can we learn? And where does this new idea of opportunity innovation fit into what you do?
One of the powerful words that was used by Dave was that technology should empower people. And the whole notion of charter schools was empowering. I can remember very much coming off of a task force that was made up of DC public school principals and teachers. And they recommended that the organization Friendship House should establish charter schools. And if you could think about 1996, 97, how new the internet was. And if you opened your browser and you typed charter schools in, you got two things. The very first thing was Center for Education Reform, and the second one was Edison Schools. That's it. That was it. Fortunately, I've been associated with both for a long time. But what we were able to do was to go around the city, and Joe Baker's sitting out there, and educate people about what charter schools were. Suddenly, parents who felt that they and their children were locked into failing schools had a choice. And I can remember when we opened our first two campuses in Washington, our Chamberlain campus and our Woodridge campus. We had almost 1,300 students enrolled in two buildings and 1,000 students on the waiting list. It was empowering. Now, what do I see? I see that we're struggling today. We're struggling today because I don't believe we have a movement any longer. I just don't. If you remember, when I was elected to the Charter School Hall of Fame, I made this statement that we're turning the movement over and putting it in the hands of the very same people who did nothing the previous 100 years. Absolutely nothing. And let me give you an example. Right here in Washington, we had the unfortunate history of having dual school systems. So what you had was lots and lots of school buildings. You had a school building on the south side of the street, a school building on the north side of the street. That turned out to be really good, because when charter schools started up, half of the buildings were empty. So we could get those buildings early on, renovate those buildings, and put children in them. Later on, they put almost a stranglehold on getting buildings, releasing the buildings to charter schools. The laws were changed, the methods for getting the schools to the charter organizations changed, and it became a hit and miss opportunity. Charter schools started renting warehouses. I have a school that's in a former Safeway store. And we did a wraparound. this is what had to be done. The next thing I see is that they're picking at the School Reform Act itself. Our charter authorizer now perceives itself as a school board. Now perceives itself as a school board. They're, in every single thing that we do, they're involved in. The freedom that we once enjoyed, the freedom to innovate, the freedom to bring parents in, all of this now is somehow regulated. We have lost our way.
Do you think that your colleagues in the traditional school sector in Washington, D.C. feel the same way about being hamstrung?
I believe that we became complacent with the second and third generation of charter leaders. They thought the job was done. And frankly, the traditional school system looked at it as an opportunity. We were sitting around applauding and passing the champagne, and they were rearming. And when I say rearm, I mean seriously, rearm. They were busy rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding, and we were still applauding our wonderfulness.
So Donald, you're describing a huge challenge in the education reform ecosystem, if you will, in Washington, D.C., between charters, traditional public schools. And David, you work with all schools across the country. Do you see this kind of divide? Are there challenges in the traditional sector that you're seeing that sound at all like what you're hearing about the charter sector?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting. You can be in, I don't know, we just given an award to Alberto Cavallo, who runs Miami-Dade, and it's a very successful urban district. And I think in the last several years I've seen great charter schools, and I've seen great district charter schools, and I've seen great district public schools which are run in the same environment, which are not charter. So I don't think it's that which is the governing force. I think what's intriguing is if you step out of the US for a second and you look at all societies now, all Western societies around the world, which have got high levels of premium on education, which have got increasingly diverse communities in them. They're all struggling with very similar metrics. So I was in Cape York in Queensland in Australia the other day, and the educational attainment scores could have been plucked out of the worst schools I've seen here. An indigenous native population struggling with exactly the same characteristics and the public system failing them. So it could have been here. I think we've got to step back and say, what are the fundamentals that we've got to achieve? And that's where there's a space for common ground rather than splitting things up. A priority on literacy and a priority on numeracy. These two fundamentals. And we actually know how to do it. I mean, that's the weird thing, is we actually know how to do it. And it's extraordinary to me that we get then lost in organizational debate of I'd rather do it this way than that way. Actually, let's make certain everybody can read and everybody's got basic numeracy, and then there's a gateway to a future. Technology is a part of that, but an equal part of that is empowering students and teachers and parents and families to become engaged. And I think that's the common ground which I'd just come back to and say that's where we should be putting the focus. There are lots of partisan debates between I want to do it this way and I want to do it that way. There are great charter schools, there are great district public schools which are not charters. The leadership in each case is the governing difference. Where you get great leaders in schools, you get great outcomes. Where you empower them, you get better outcomes. Where you empower them and get great leaders and apply technology, then we get fantastic outcomes. And where you fail on all of those, you get a fail.
That's a great point. I mean, we've even seen that here in DC. I believe Friendship once took over one of the ailing public schools, and I think there's been other opportunities where traditional sectors come to see, for example, your robotics department. You want to talk a little bit about that aspect of the work here and maybe what you've seen in your other cities?
No, we were more than 10 years ago asked to operate the Anacostia High School here. So we reached out to take whatever we had learned from operating our high school to take it to the traditional public school system. It worked very well. We've done the same thing in Baltimore. We've done the same thing in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So there is a effort to reach out. The issue is not just reaching out. It is the expectation that just because you put your name on it, that there is an immediate result. If a child was reading at the 4th grade level, when you took over the school last year, that child was not reading at the 10th grade level the following school year. And so there has to be a general discussion around how do we measure success with these collaborations. It's not just a matter of I put my name on it and suddenly it has changed. That isn't true.
So Donald, part of the manifesto actually addresses assessments head on, and the notion that perhaps accountability should be more focused on student results than abstract scores. One could argue that many of us are responsible for those abstract scores we have today. So what's your favorite prescription, your model for student-centered accountability or for accountability? And David, how does your industry work in that?
For me, you go first.
We use, to be fair, we use multiple assessments. We use portfolios. We use, obviously, the map testing, which is everyone's favorite nowadays because we believe it's an accurate predictor. Those are things that we believe are important. What we don't want to do is to just pile tests on kids. There's a movement out here where parents are rebelling against that. And I think that we might be missing out by not listening more closely to what parents believe ought to be done.
I agree completely. I think the balance there between the summative assessment world and the formative assessment is completely cacophony. So the reality is children in schools spend weeks and weeks preparing for summative assessments, which actually don't actually help that child at that moment at all. They get drilled to pass that test. The results come through 2-3 months later. You can't link anything. And we don't spend nearly enough time on the learning moment, on the data created by a particular child has learned something now. What are they ready for next? I think that there's a great piece of research, Benjamin Bloom's 2 Sigma analysis, which is just foundational, which should be sort of required, but somehow we've forgotten, which basically says get close to the student and you can improve outcomes. And with the same body of students, you can improve the whole set of outcomes. So using formative assessment techniques, embedding a little bit more technology to give that rapid feedback loop to the teacher of saying, student X is ready for this, let's get him to do that now, and allow us to personalize, allow us to bring education to the individual at the point where they are. Those are all things which we can do right now, and we should do. And we should just get away from the sort of the death march of the summative assessment.
You're touching on the notion of personalized learning,
Yeah.
which can be done in a whole host of ways in a brick and mortar school and online school. I'd be remiss if I didn't raise and also challenge us around this notion of this death march to assessments. It's also a death march that we seem to have around research, right? So every day there seems to be another report coming out condemning some way, shape, or form, some kind of school model that we are undertaking because somewhere, somehow, a bunch of researchers concluded after shaking up a bunch of data that something didn't work. Now, I know my friends and colleagues in the room who are from the traditional public school sector are probably saying, we told you so, because many of you stood and said that. I sort of feel like that person who, when I was 21, I was so smart, my parents didn't know anything, and now that I'm their age, I realize how much they knew. Because there will be another report, for example, in the next couple of days that a charter organization puts out saying online learning of certain ways doesn't work, based on some research that maybe only took a few months. There will be an assessment that comes out tomorrow that says a particular kind of school doesn't work. How do we get personalized learning? How do we open up and allow people to take risks? A word that is actually a positive word in business, but to take risks when we are ready to jump and pounce on someone in a year's time for not taking a fourth grader to a 10th grade, a fourth grade reading level to a 10th grade reading level overnight, while still maintaining accountability, which we all obviously believe is clear and compelling.
Well, I do have a view, and I think some of this is allowing educational leaders, celebrating educational leaders who are taking those risks and making certain that we showcase what they're doing and where they're doing it well, because that's the nature of how one makes progress. And we do have a wonderful laboratory across the 50 states. We do have lots of laboratories across all the 30,000 school districts in the country, where we can point to schools which have made choices. Now, you do have the sort of the bias that comes in all research, which is that you watch something and weird things begin to happen. So the crucial thing in scaling is to be able to look at a model, check that it works, try it in a different environment, and then start working out what are the variables that allow for this to be successful. So something that works in a rural area isn't necessarily, you just can't pick it up and drop it into an urban and say, that's the answer. We've got to have that level of flexibility.
I want you to continue to emphasize the whole idea of expanding choice for parents and students.
That's a lever to personalize.
Absolutely. Online education does work for some people, but this is the reason we have choice. You can find what works best for your child. And that's what you take advantage of. But if these options are not available, then what do you do? We're back to what we have.
And in your network, and in the work that you've modeled your network after, do you see a wide variety of these things? You have all of them working? You have online and blended? Yeah, I mean, this seems to me the crux of the issue.
We also see that in higher ed, bits of the process are much further along. So the other day I was in Austin, and I was with a remarkable academic guy called David Lordy, who's got an incoming cohort of 500 people doing chemistry. And he described to me how, 10 years ago, his goal was to spot the 20% who were going to be on the pre-med track, who were going to get an A, to get them through, and then just not worry. Chemistry is difficult, 80% are going to fall by the wayside. And how now, because he personalizes, and that's in a section of 500, he uses technology, he harnesses it, and he actually says, how do I make certain I remediate before it's gone really wrong? Keeps the whole level of class there, raises the standard as a whole. And I think last year he told me he had 300 A's, and his big question was the university coming to him saying, was this grade inflation? And he turned around to them and said, this was the highest caliber of cohort that I've ever produced, because they all succeeded together. So we do think of the curve, and we think of it wrongly. We've got to keep remembering, Benjamin Bloom says we can move the whole curve up, and that should be the goal.
And this goes to something you said, Governor Engler mentioned it, Donald, you've certainly said similar. We know what we're doing. We've done these things before. And again, unlike when many of us started looking and saying, what could we do differently in the advent of Nation at Risk, we have technology access, right? We can look up things. We can watch the TED Talk about the hole in the wall and the children in India who immediately, when given access, to a tablet, start coding. Like, what is possible is mind-blowing. And yet we're constrained by and fixed by the existing system. So John, I'd love for you to mention that, and as he's answering, I'd love to start engaging those of you who are here. Please, if you have a question, signal to me or someone who's standing with a mic, and we'll start opening up this discussion. But Donald, do you want to go ahead and take a shot at that, or you want me to? Okay. Susan, do we have a mic? CER staff? Great. Ford, come up here to the front, please.
So David, you have the advantage of being a relative newcomer, as you said, and also the advantage of running this marvelous global learning and education company. What would you tell us? Where is it done better, and how do they do it better? Why is ours as broken as we think it is? And if so, how do we do it better?
Great, Susan. I'm glad you asked it that way. The other day I was in the world's probably the most highest achieving school district in the world, called Minhang District in Shanghai, and do a bunch of things that we could never imagine doing. Longitudinal data retained on every student from the very first entry in K right the way through to 12. Every single piece of gobbet of data tracked, recorded. They can't imagine a world where you don't do that. I'm not sure I'd want to live in that, the world of total control of longitudinal data. So that's one difference. The second difference is they do not have an obligation in Shanghai to educate every child. So if you happen to be one of the migrant workers in Shanghai, you don't go to school. So we very easily, we can look at our schools, and actually they are catering the requirement to deliver education to everybody. That's the fundamental building block that we've got here. That's a huge asset that we've got, which we turn somehow against ourselves. So we're not celebrating the fact that we have this, and we're not achieving the potential that we've got. Having decided to educate everybody, we know that we can get everybody to read. We shouldn't aim for 90%. I mean, it's a joke. We should be aiming for complete literacy and complete numeracy. That's not an unattainable goal by any means. So I think we beat ourselves up by not understanding our obligations and the benefits of them. And at the same time, we're not harnessing that because of some parts of the fragmented nature of the system we're just not seeing. And everybody's experience through education is so personal. If they live in a district which is doing well, they can have a great public education here. And at the same time, they could come into a district where there's a train crash of outcomes. And having the dialogue, I mean, that's what's so wonderful about Jeanne convening this space. Having the dialogue which says we've got to get beyond our personal lived experience and start encountering these different lived experiences and then synthesize the benefits from that. That's the opportunity here.
Yes, Claudia, over on the right.
Could all three respond to the question? Initially, the charter school movement was seen as an opportunity to develop an R&D, research and development arm for public education, and even people like L. Schenker saw them as laboratories for innovation, best practices that could be shared. What happened? Why did this relationship become adversarial or worse? Where did that change? And how do you restore it?
It probably got changed when the first charter school opened. That to me is the whole essence of a charter school, in the sense that parents had a choice if they wanted their child to be an artist. There was probably a charter school that educated that child. And so I've never viewed a charter school as an R&D unit for the public school system. And I've been in this business 19 years. Never.
So I have a slightly different take on it. I do think that was intended by some people who first embraced it, just like lots of people adopt lots of ideas and the impetus and the intentions are different. I think there was a point in time where there was a superintendent who would look down the road and say, I want to do that better. I want to do something better, because there was some pressure. I do think that whether we admit it or not, many of the things we talk about today in technology and blended learning, for example, did have or was born in, were born in charters. But I do think that there was a lot more, maybe not deliberate or intentional, there was a lot more collaboration among rank and file educators and parents across charters and cities. As we used to travel across the country and engage in conversations, we would see a lot of different people below the quote-unquote leader and influencer level having conversations and talking, and from the same community. I think as many movements as this one matured, it became much more siloed. And so I do think at the heart of the people and the educators who are leading some of the schools out there, both charter and traditional schools, there is a lot of interesting collaboration. And I do think that we have a generation of younger entrants and actors to the education world that come by life much more collaboratively and interested in new solutions than perhaps the pioneers were and could be. And so I don't know if that's necessarily an answer, but I do think there's part of it. I would, though, applaud Donald's very clear, direct comment, because when legislators say to us, can we please build in a requirement that charters and traditional public schools collaborate in order to get a charter or to be paid, and we say, well, it's not going to happen because you can't make a horse drink, right? You can provide and you can support. So I do think, however, it is a two-way street. Increasingly, it needs to be, even if it hasn't been today. Donna, would you disagree?
I absolutely don't believe it's been a two-way street. I do believe that charters have reached out, and the barriers, by the way, are huge in terms of working with the traditional school system. And I say that because we were talking about innovation in a meeting earlier today, and there's an article that was printed today, and the article is announcing that my schools are all being turned into solar powered schools, and so much so that we will be able to sell the extra wattage and reduce our electric bills considerably. This same company had attempted to get, obviously, if they're settling on us when there are so many public schools available, then this is a settle. But they're getting the opportunity to show what they can do in this smaller setting. We're a laboratory, and if we can save a huge amount of money, then how much money can be saved by the traditional system, which has 120 schools?
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Christina Culver with NetNexus Advisors, and Jeanne, thank you for hosting. This is a great program. Donald, you are just such a great leader in our community. Thank you. I have a question. I want to go back to the innovation piece. So one of the big things that is preventing the scaling and growth here is the actual lack of competency at the decision-making level, which is at the district and state level where all the purchasing is done, and the acquisitions and the transformation. And so if you have 1 in 10, 1 in 50, depending on where you go, what school district or where you are in the country, they don't have that level of competency to even understand the technology, talking about the interoperability aspects or anything. They're just making purchases willy-nilly. And so you have the lack of competency on one side, and then the teaching force comes from a non-selective service process. And so when you don't have our best and brightest in the country driving innovation and opportunity, so the combination of civil rights leadership and innovators, how do we get to that? And maybe you can address how other countries do it, because they do have a highly selective process for the teaching force. And we're just not, our higher education system hasn't really been willing to make that leap and change how we bring our best and brightest into this workforce and to do this work.
Again, I think there are a number of things that you pick up there, and I think it would be very, it's a bit of a trope to sort of point to the weaknesses in the teaching force and the capabilities of individual teachers. I'd like to step back one and say, the structure whereby a superintendent is on an electoral treadmill and needs to demonstrate progress in a very short window of time to an environment is actually a real problem. So what you see around the country is superintendents who, I think the average is now down to slightly less than 4 years of tenure. In that time, so they come in, the first year's already cooked, they can't do anything. That's 1 year gone, and by the way, the last year they're already leaving, so there's nothing going to happen then. So you've got this very short window in the middle when, for the vast majority of districts, stuff happens. It is really difficult in an environment where you've got to structure teacher professional development, training, and all of those things to make any change, to make a difference in that short window of time. And all too often what happens, I made the comment about technology spend being wasted, is effectively the one thing you can do is send your kids home with a shiny box and say, I've taken my district digital. And the parents all see that the children come home with a shiny object and it's gone digital. And actually the fact that there's no structure, there's no pedagogy, there's no content, that all goes by the wayside. So I think structurally we need to think about great schools tend to have persistence and tenure and a lot of characteristics that we condemn. Yeah, but we'll often look at the public system and say there's long tenure, that's a problem. Actually, long tenure is often a hallmark of great success because great teachers and great cultures in schools really don't come about in a week. It takes years and they accumulate. So I think we've got to change some of our thinking around that. And around some of these, the pressures to go digital, people don't know what that means. And I think there are blueprints that we should be sharing. We certainly put out white papers on how you take districts digital. And it is shocking to me that the balance of spend goes to what are the objects that I can buy to send home with the children, because that'll get them off, that'll get the parents off my back. So not quite the answer that I think you're going there. The other piece is raising the status of teachers in our society should be an absolute imperative for all of us. We should be celebrating, and the way to start, I think, is to look at the head teachers, the people who actually are leading schools, and we should be, through the round table and other things, introducing these people, because when they work, these are phenomenal leaders, and we should be showcasing them and really highlighting their contribution in a very dramatic way. We don't. We let them pass by the wayside.
And speaking of competency, I know we have another question over here, but just one point in Ted Coldery's new book, Split Screen Strategy, which we commend to all of you. He talks about these cooperatives of teachers that are beginning to look back on the charter concept in a renewed way. And if you actually have school-based decisions with money at the site level, you get people who develop a competency for what they're doing at the site level, right? That is very much part of the charter concept, but it's also a concept that increasingly reform-minded school districts are adopting for their people. And so I think if we start looking at real power, this nomenclature of local control that we've heard in the last year is so overblown, because local control really is about people closest to kids. And I think we have to actually remind ourselves and remind people around the country of that, particularly again, in light of a presidential election where local control becomes a default to traditional organizations running around as opposed to people. And so I think if part of the policy, Christine, is targeted towards trying to get teachers empowered to make decisions wherever they are, we may actually see competencies in making those choices increase. Yes, sir.
Okay, following sort of on that conversation, so I've spent most of my career doing human capital work, primarily for charter schools in the New York area. And so for 13 years, I've recruited teachers, recruited all the whole staff of these schools, some of the best, all the names. Democracy Prep has been my client forever. But one of the disturbing things that I've noticed in this vein of sort of turning and being introspective as a movement is that I see far too many charter schools that just recreate the same staffing model as the school down the street. There's like so little creativity, and you know, in my mind, the whole reason why, you know, I sort of spent my life doing this is we have this flexibility, and it seems like the only flexibility that we use the most is firing people, basically. But I see the same old, we need a full-time teacher. Well, you know, there's this great person that maybe is semi-retired that's got 15, 20 years of teaching experience. Why couldn't they come in and maybe teach part-time? But it's kind of like, part of it is I think a lot of the leaders, at least early on, were DOE people in New York, people from the Board of Ed, and they just kind of recreated the same model. So what can we do to kind of, I guess, push ourselves to be more innovative, particularly on the staffing and the way we structure the org charts of schools, since we have this flexibility in the charter school, you know, movement in particular?
I think we have probably given that considerable thought. And I say that about our high school because we have a fairly large number of advanced placement courses. So we have, in fact, hired college professors to come in part-time to teach those AP courses. So it's certainly, it's a money saver too, by the way, because you're not paying benefits. But it provides, I think, a well of opportunity for kids to get significantly more advanced thinking, and it's been very successful for us. So we definitely believe that that is a model that can be followed.
But part of the reason that, wouldn't you agree, and you referred earlier to your authorizer in Washington, you know, part of this introspection too, let's be honest, we've asked the proponents of what we've often called the status quo to change the way they do business and be reflective about how their institutions work or don't work. I think we have to do the same thing. Authorizers tend to make you want to prove you can do something these days before you even have done something. Does that have anything to do with it?
I think
Is that a loaded question?
I don't think it has anything to do with it, but I do believe that the hasty way that schools are judged really closes the door for significant innovation. You've got to test something. You've got to have the opportunity for that to either succeed or fail. You may have to make changes to it. It's just because you said it should be done doesn't necessarily mean it is going to be done the first time. And I think that that's what we face. The room for innovation is the doors keep closing.
Let me do a quick follow-up on that, if you don't mind, both of you, before we go to our next question. So once upon a time, Milton Friedman called me and chided me for talking about charter schools. I was actually in the position now occupied by Lindsay Burke at the Heritage Foundation back in '90 when that happened. And he said, my dear, charter schools are the palliative to reform. Because what they'll do is they will make people not want to do more, and government will start coming in and creeping in and developing things that prevent people from really having innovation and choice. He's the father. If Ted Coldery is sort of the father of charter schools, perhaps Al Shanker is a godfather of charter schools. One could argue Milton Friedman is the father of vouchers. You can be agnostic on this, obviously, David, but I love your comments too. Are charter schools the palliative to reform? Have we seen that predicted in full circle?
It's true that if you slightly improve things, you remove the pressure to change. That said, I don't think that there's a single panacea here. Just because, I come back to Miami-Dade, I think what they're doing there is remarkable, and that's not a charter-led innovation environment. I do think that you've got to step out of the States for a moment and start looking at the fact that these are not just problems in this society at this time. We've got a world which is putting a premium on knowledge base, and we've got to ensure that we deliver to that. At the same time, we've got this incredible opportunity through diversity to deliver a much richer population than ever, and we have to be on that. Now, when I look at, say, I don't know, I was at my first day in the US in my job, I went to an ed tech conference, and I had two themes. You know, Wi-Fi flowed like water in this conference, and then I went to the closest school, and it didn't. And every single word in this conference was in English, and the closest high school was functionally operating in Spanish. So I think we've got to just sit back and say, there are bigger things at play here than charter or not charter. When it comes down to being a zero-sum game, $1 to the district public school or $1 to the district charter school, you're going to get this debate. And I think what you're doing that's wonderful is saying we need to elevate the debate and put education, importance of education, back up the agenda so that we're not in a zero-sum game. We should be looking for the best of both. The charter system's not going to go away, nor, by the way, is the district public school. We can think we're going to abolish it, but it's not going to go away because we're going to have to deal with both. So we've got to optimize both. There are great charters, celebrate them, let's do the best we can there. There are great district schools. There are fantastic things happening. We need to do that. I don't think it's a zero-sum, one or the other.
I don't feel that charters are going to go away. I do believe that they will be so hamstrung that they will be almost like the traditional school system. I can see the news tightening every day. There's some law, our city government, the seat of government is just a couple blocks from here. And I'm absolutely sure they're down there cooking up one more thing that doesn't work. And that I really believe is the issue.
Yes, sir, in the middle table right here.
I think
Oh,
I'm
no, sorry,
next.
there's another one.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just so happy to be able to hear this conversation. I've got two ideas that I want you to mess around a bit with. One of them has to do with race and class. Charter schools have been used in some very interesting ways in jurisdictions to begin to address those issues, and in many instances not doing them very well for minority and particularly African American students. And I'd like your take on that. The other thing that I've had running around in my head is this whole issue of legacy systems. This country is 18th in broadband in the world, even though we invented it, because of our legacy systems. How much of our current public education system is legacy that we just can't seem to get rid of? And I don't know that charters or anything else is going to do it without a larger look at change in the broader context. So I'd like your reaction to both of those things.
Great question.
On the issue of race and class, Connie, I do believe that there are significant regional differences. I don't believe that that's an issue or as much of an issue in Washington, D.C. I think it is being made an issue with the whole notion of putting in these boundaries that are being discussed by our city government now, that what in fact will occur, we are going to condemn the kids in Ward 7 and Ward 8 to going to school in Ward 8, waiting on the public school to improve there. I don't think that is a good way of acting. I do believe that charters have opened doors to poor children. I don't want to just use my school as an example, but I will. We have a college-going population of about 82% of our graduates. That is huge, and almost all of them are first-time college goers. Many are first-time high school graduates. But what we have hopefully ingrained in them is this whole issue of persistence. It is not necessarily that you have the highest scholastic aptitude test, but if you work hard, you can succeed. If you don't give up, you can succeed. That is what I think my charter school has done in terms of this whole notion of inequality.
absolutely right. Sort of the very vexed history and the complexities are being aggravated by this drift to a knowledge society where income is so tightly, income generation, not wealth, but income generation increasingly tied to skill base. So it's shocking that such a large part of the talent pool is being ignored and opportunities are not finding their way there. So I think the structures and systems that we've got to adopt need to improve hugely. And I look downstream of the environment that this debate has essentially been a K-12 debate. And let me broaden it for a second. And I think when you're in the higher ed system and you see that the graduation rates in, say, I don't know, the average graduation rate in community college in this country is sitting now at 30%. So 7 out of 10 fail or don't get where they should. That's not about the capabilities of those people. It's about the process which put them there. And so I'd come back and I'd say, I think one of the things we're beginning to see is that if you use great teachers who are supported by data, they can intervene and make a difference. So you get that effect of that personalization that Benjamin Bloom was talking about. That intimacy between teacher and pupil is what's required. And I think that would address this. And then you're going to get the great models coming through. And we celebrate persistence. Actually, keep going. Just keep going. That's the crucial thing. Don't give up.
There's also, just really quick, Connie, a reference in the manifesto I'd love to call your attention to, just a paragraph that addresses that perhaps we've also caused some of the divisions today because we've overlooked that there are suburban communities who want and need reform, and we've maybe, by talking about change and innovation only for those who, by the way, need it most and where our proper social focus was, the poor and disenfranchised, we may have divided from people who actually are not only also populating the world, but tend to already have more power.
But I also believe that we have got to more effectively use technology in education. Individualized learning. We cannot expect that every child learns at the same pace. And that is a damning quality of our school systems, is that you came here, you're 30 days here, whatever. And kids learn at different paces. And so that opportunity needs to be afforded them. I hope one day we even get to the point where we have a discussion about dropping grades. And when I say grades, first grade, second grade, why can we not have it where we are moving children when they master the standards? And it may take a little longer for Johnny to be successful. Johnny may not graduate high school at 17, he may be 18 or 19, because it just takes a little longer. It doesn't mean that it can't succeed.
If I can pick that up, because I think that then is the interface, this business that people graduate, and parents can celebrate their youngster's successful graduation. That same youngster goes into the higher ed system and fails immediately. So they didn't graduate. They had completed the seat time. They hadn't actually learned the prerequisites. Now we have structurally then a bigger challenge there, which is that you'll go to schools and colleges around the country and there's no link between the math faculty in the local 4-year school or 2-year school and what's being taught in all the high schools close by. No link. And in fact, you try and convene groups of teachers who are teaching the same groups of children, and it's like, wow, you're doing that? We didn't know you did that. It's extraordinary. So this gulf, which can only be solved at the local level of convening local community colleges with a local school saying, this is what you've got to do, and the local 4-year state school, get them together.
I know we have a question there, and then forward after we need to come to this middle table. Would you all put your hands up? We still have a question so they can see. Okay, great. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kayla Brandon. I'm a reporter with the Independent Journal Review, and our audience is largely parents, and they're really frustrated with Common Core math. So my two questions are, do you think the Common Core math standards are working better than the previous models? And what would you say to parents that are voicing their concerns that can't help their kids with their math homework?
I believe that it is far too early to make that decision. And I say that because we are just now to the point where teachers are more proficient in teaching the more detailed view of mathematics. We're no longer just saying 2 + 2 are 4, but there's more analysis behind that. And so it's taken some time, and therefore it's going to take some time really for teachers to become proficient and for the students to reflect that.
We have one over here, and then we'll take the gentleman. Go ahead.
So as a student, a graduate of DC Public Charter Schools, DCPS and DC Public Charter Schools, I'm a graduate of Friendship, I often wonder why we're missing out on the people who actually have a stake in this, the parents and the students. So we're in a policy conversation today, but I wonder how many actual DC Public Charter School students or DCPS students we have in the room, and how many parents we have in the room. And I think sometimes we fall into this habit of expecting the parents to come to us and expecting the students to come to us. How then, as leaders in this work, do we go to them and get them to invest and get them to care about this policy? And how do we get them to be the leaders in this work? Because in this room, I also wonder how many of us are sending our children to public charter schools in the city.
I will certainly respond to that. I won't put Jeanne on the spot. I honestly believe that is the principal area that charter schools have failed. That the whole quote-unquote school reform movement, for some reason, felt that it could happen without parents. And only to get into the difficult political situations that we are now in to find out that we have no constituents. And you can tell, because anytime you need a group of parents to go with you to the city council or even to the Congress, because that is going to have some impact, you have a heck of a time trying to pull them all together. You almost have to call a Congress, to be honest.
Mark Lerner here. We need thousands of more quality seats here in DC. But when you talk to charter leaders and talk to them about replication, they're scared because they're worried about the performance management framework and how they're going to be tiered when they expand. And you look at the number of applications that the Public Charter School Board is getting now per year, and they're very, very low. They're getting 1 to 2 applications a year because they're expected to be Tier 1 on day 1. So how do we get these extra seats while holding charter schools accountable?
You're welcome to jump in, but I do want to say that this is central to the theme of the manifesto, that by having competing, varying systems of accountability that are different between a charter and a traditional school, that put a different onus on them from day one, they're supposed to be successful, measured by accountability of their contract. Don't forget, these accountability systems were all started after charters said, hold us accountable for our results. We'll tell you how those results are. You approve us based on that. To the gentleman's question earlier, then the other systems were supposed to rise up and say, hold us accountable for what we're achieving. If we're a dropout prevention school, hold us accountable for whether we're preventing it. If we're an arts school, hold us accountable for whether we're getting people into the arts, skills, etc. And so instead of having systems of schools that Howard Fuller once described them, we're creating a new school system. We're trying to create the system, in large part, that we sought to dismantle and change and create dynamic innovations in. So I think that, I don't know how Donald would answer that, but I do believe that this is at the heart of, we absolutely applaud organizations like that board for having a high standard. Are they setting a standard, though, that's actually regulatory in nature as opposed to aspirational and achievement focused on students?
I think there has to be some balance. If in fact, Mark, the only thing we're doing is closing down a school and you just move those same children who can't read to another school, what did you do? You just limited the opportunity that they may have. And I think that some balance has to be there. So you close down a school, it's closed. Now, the 100 kids or 200 kids who could not read, you now have sent them to the charter school down the street. So then you'll close it next, and then close the next one, and close the next. Kids will have been passed, because you're then encouraging social promotion, of course. But then you will have passed them on. They still can't read. They'll get to complete high school and can't fill out a job application because they've just been shuttled along.
Which is what we all have to be concerned about. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, this question is addressed to Donald Hintz. Donald, as an innovator and leader in the public charter school system, as I am a witness to, communication and education is very important in getting the word out, and this forum is tremendous, it really is. But what do you see, or what would you like to see us do in the room and in other places to continue to move this information forward, to help educate more people about the choices that are in the school systems for parents, because children don't learn the same. Online learning is one way, and you've instituted that. You've done a lot with the schools that you have, and you're continuing to grow and continuing to move forward. But what can we do? I mean, this is one forum. What other forums are there, and what can we do to help move this along in terms of educating and communicating to people?
I don't believe we have enough convenings. They won't have to be as fancy as this, clearly. But we need more opportunities to actually talk about the issues and the problems our children face, problems our schools face. We're in a wealthy city. How many cities have $1.5 billion in a reserve fund? And yet the schools are moderately okay. And I do say moderately okay. We need to talk more as parents, as taxpayers.
I have a question.
More questions.
Is that with the expansion of charter schools, I assume that part of the reason you're finding lack of support is because many of the schools are straying away from the original purpose and just becoming businesses.
What do you mean by that, Thornell? I'd like to know.
You know, we're in a business environment,
Yes.
and people are always thinking about ways to make money. The original planners for charter school had probably primarily educational focus. Now it's become a money-making operation in some instances.
Okay, I'm not sure exactly what you're alluding to. I probably can find one example, but most charter schools in Washington are run by the entity that got the charter. Very few charter schools are run by management companies. But there's nothing wrong with a management company. And I think that is something that often punished. There's nothing wrong with a for-profit company. There's nothing wrong with a management company. There frankly is nothing wrong with vouchers. The issue is, are we helping parents educate their children? Society is the beneficiary for this. And we've got to also stop the notion, Thornell, that just because someone made made a profit off of something, that something's wrong with it. I don't believe that.
I'm reminded of I was in Indianapolis several years ago, and there was a billboard ad, and it said, Indiana University, Purdue, why not both? Because I guess they were combining to have an institution in Indianapolis, and I remember thinking, why not both? That's a great slogan for us. Why not both? Why not all? Right? Getting to the heart of kids matter.
Yeah.
Educators matter, the people close to our kids matter, convenings matter, these discussions, there are not, the assumption that there are a bunch of people leading organizations, including us, that have figured it out and are already doing it has got to be put away. The number of times we hear on a daily basis, oh, so-and-so who runs that, you should talk to so-and-so, they're running that organization, they're handling it. I think if anyone says someone's handling it, it assumes the whole problem is done. There's more to be done. There's an entire nation of somewhat close to 70% of kids who barely read, write, spell proficiently. So that's why we're here, to start, again, a series of convenings to encourage people who are already doing this locally that many of us never see because they don't come here, they're working, they don't do these kinds of things professionally on a regular basis. We have the luxury of being focused on it, and really to generate a discussion first and foremost around innovation opportunity opens up the landscape to a lot more people that are ever in our conversations, regardless of where you stand on a charter, a voucher, Common Core, or anything else.
I'm not gonna let this go. Thornell and I have been friends for more than 40 years, so I'm not gonna let this rest. Friendship, like most of the charters in Washington, in fact, all of the charters in Washington, is a nonprofit corporation. This nonprofit corporation has to buy and sell property, build schools, issue bonds, pay salaries, pay benefits. I'm sorry, there's no difference. And not only that, if we run a deficit, they'll close us down. Okay? So we have to manage our money and manage it well. So yes, it is a business, and we manage ours very well.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Dennis Richmond Jr. I'm interning with the UNCF and the Walton Family Foundation and BAO, the Black Alliance for Educational Options. My question is, with charter schools, we know that once the work with the students is done for, say, until they graduate, the work truly isn't done. With that being said, a lot of students want to see themselves in the curriculums in which they study. In the world of academia, that's one of the most important points. The Urban League recently released a report called The State of Black America showing that 70% of students who attend historically black colleges and universities graduate on time. Is there a pipeline between certain charter schools with certain institutions to ensure students are going to college? Or is it just a free-for-all where students get to choose freely? Is there any kind of pipeline set up?
Some schools have set up partnerships with colleges and universities. And our school is one that has. So that does happen. But in most instances, the number of students going, it's too small to say we have a partnership. There has to be some value there on both sides. Because when you say you're accepted, the tuition, room and board still has to be paid.
That is a great idea, and we should pursue it. Yes, ma'am. 1, 2, 3, and I think we're done then. Okay,
Here.
right here.
Okay. I don't want to push the race and class dimension as far as I would like to, or as far as I think it needs to be pushed, even in DC. But I would like to suggest that the big funders, the big interests who want to put money behind education research and justify the agenda that they may have, invariably are looking at quantitative data and analysis. Almost never qualitative analysis that would tell us what is working for whom, under what conditions, and answer the questions how and why. If we could get serious qualitative data and analysis, I think we might get closer to removing the stigma that does remain around race and class, which has reached the point, maybe now the tyranny of low expectations is about as far as we've gotten. We have not gotten to what you describe as embracing diversity by any means, even here in DC. And poverty, of course, is huge and beyond the borders of the school. But qualitative analysis and a real understanding of why things are working is missing in this discussion. And I don't see how your agenda, Jeanne, of innovation and opportunity equals results can proceed without it.
I agree.
So I think there's a huge gap that you're right to point to. And the challenge, of course, with any qualitative research is finding bases which allow it to be made comparable and extendable into wider areas. So I just acknowledge the issue. I think one of the things that we're trying to do very directly is we made a decision about 6-7 months ago that we've got about 5 billion individual responses to questions. Not only right and wrong, but also confidence level and sequence, what happened before, what happened afterwards. And we've set up a research board to open that for open academic research so that people can do that. I'd come back to the question of standards, because as we get more online systems and more data collected in the systems, the ability to create and access that data is fundamental. So we've said absolutely that data has to be made available for public research. Confidence is the first thing that we can assess, and the learning pathway. And I think that's, for us, that would be the first step. But I absolutely agree, when you're in a classroom, the qualitative responses, the teacher knows first that it's working long before the scores tell it. So you're right.
We have one question up here. I'm very aware that we're running over. I also am very aware that I'm always the last person who doesn't get to ask the question. So if you need to leave, feel free. We'll finish up the questions just here in a minute. Thank you.
I keep hearing about parents and following the money here, and I'm wondering if anybody here is pushing for veterans and military families to be able to have full school choice. Most places they can't even apply because they're not a taxpayer in that district, so they don't even get to apply.
What is going on right now in Washington is there is a task force that is looking at putting a charter school on Joint Base Anacostia. Right now, a fairly large number of our online students are residing at Joint Base Anacostia. And they find that convenient because you can package it up anywhere in the world. And
I love that concept. I also love the concept that was alive a few years ago on the Hill, which was basically a national voucher. If you're military and you come home, you need to be able to send your child anywhere, anytime, and our money should follow those kids anywhere. And I think we need to resurrect that. Absolutely. Great idea. Okay, time for one. Okay, yes, one of the students, please. And will you remind us where you're from and where your school is and what grade you're in?
Hi, I'm Keely Sonoto. I'm in 9th grade from the Freedom Prep Charter School in Camden, New Jersey. And my question is, how is the implementation of charter schools, especially for scholars in Camden, where our learning expectations are a little bit lower standard than normal cities such as Washington, D.C. and in New York? How is this charter school exactly helping us scholars?
Look, I can't believe, if I heard you correctly, you said, how is it if the school has a lower standard? If you look at it, but we all have to conform to the same state assessments. So I don't believe the standards themselves can be lower. There may be varying quality, and I think that there's varying quality within any public or private school.
Are you saying how is the charter being held to a higher standard, or how is the charter helping you be held to a higher standard?
How is the charter school helping us raise ourselves to like a higher standard?
In our schools, the one way we try to differentiate it is that we have a longer school day, a longer school year, and the requirements for graduation are larger.
Partly because you can get closed down much more quickly than a traditional public school. And so there's an impetus to do that. So do well so your school doesn't get closed. Which I know you guys are, otherwise you wouldn't be in Washington, D.C. I know it was a treat for you all. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Mateo with Foundations Institute, and my question is something that we've all kind of touched on just a little bit. I kind of see education as a supply chain, and it's very fragmented between K-12 and higher ed. Do you guys ever look downstream to higher ed, see how your graduates are performing? Do you guys ever look outside of your building to see how you're doing?
Yeah, we have an alumni association, and we actually have full-time staff whose only job is to stay in contact with our graduates on college campuses. Also on college campuses, we have what are called ambassadors. They are paid by us to look out for other friendship students who may be matriculating on a particular college campus. And we've had that now for some years. I'm trying to see if any of you...
David?
I'll add something to that. You know, from our perspective, we have as large a business in higher ed as there is in K-12. Higher ed is far more advanced in the development of online learning systems and adaptive pathways. We have more than 3 million students using them in higher ed. And so the way that we're spending, it's coming up to $200 million a year building new software. As we look at the world of schools, is we're saying these core adaptive engines will start in the higher ed space, and they are inexorably and inevitably coming towards the K-12 world, and it's one and the same set of algorithms.
But there's very little overall data that not only tracks what Donald was talking about and what David's referring to in the K-12 space, but does so where there's apples to apples comparisons, the way maybe a Heckman is done for preschool and the persistence rate. And that's again because there's this rush to, if it's not working 3 to 4 years, let's move it on, as opposed to if it's not working 3 to 4 years, let's iterate, new experiment, do more, look at it, and feel like you actually have some advances you can make at that point in time. Okay, final question. Yes?
I hope this is to help move forward the original question that you posed in the beginning. My name is Talia Gibbons. I'm at United Negro College Fund. And one thing that the UNCF does is we took our advocacy for K-12. And one of our most recent research talked about parents feeling like the charter movement and what's happening in their school districts are happening to us and not with us. And as you opened up the conversation, it was, what happened to our movement? And I think thinking of the student and the parent as the real true customer. Young people are born into this world and parents start the work and they're sending them to the schools and I think they want to feel that partnership, that you're going to pick up where I now left off from the pre-kindergarten all the way through. And so in getting this movement back on fire, it seems to me that the impetus should be back on who our customer and rekindling that real partnership so that parents and students can feel like this is the extension of my home when I go to school and not a barrier or a fight against what I think should happen with my child and what you're doing to my child in that sense. So My question is, how do we get back to that connection and rebuild it? Somebody posed that earlier, but I don't think we really, as we go to the next forum, and I'm glad to see we're all the decision makers, we're the policy people, or we're the trying to build active work, but at the ground level, we got to get back to the parent, to the customer, and that's even looking at business. Business looks at who are they serving, and if they're not meeting that customer need, they got to rethink their product to really get to the needs of what parents say. So here, letting them lead us may be a way of getting us there.
Thank you, Talia. I absolutely think you've hit the nail on the head, and it's a great closing question. The answers are in part by saying exactly what you said. Secondly, by having coalitions that include organizations like yours across the spectrum, lots of different organizations at lots of different levels instead of being siloed. And frankly, by encouraging funders and the people who support and engage in all of these efforts, whether it's on the business level or whether it's the foundation level, to make sure that parents and parent engagement is actually something that's supported. It's interesting how little it is. I remember having someone say to me years ago, why I was telling a parent story. I picked up the phone one night and I talked to a parent and wrote notes, and they said, why are you talking to a parent? And I told the story. Oh, this parent called and said such and such. I said, why are you talking to a parent? You should be talking to governors. No, I should be talking to both, right? And so I think there's a reality in that. At the same time, we also need to curate some of that information. When Governor Engler talked about transparency, we have a call for transparency. Parents won't get engaged unless they have information that makes sense to them. What are we spending? Why are we spending it? How are we spending it? Why is this different? What's happening? So information and data, the kind that is supplied by and as a result of the work, David, organizations like yours are doing. Donald, you certainly wouldn't have waiting list parents unless they felt engaged, and I think it's expanding that more and more, and you're right, we're not hitting it out of the park yet. Last words, David, Donald, thank you so much for spending the time with us. Last words.
Jeanne, thank you very much. I think we've got to raise the focus, and it's notable that in the presidential, none of them are really talking about education. And I think we need to put that on the agenda. From my perspective, it's moving from a discussion of inputs to outputs to start saying what are the results and how do we drive better results, how do we personalize, and how do we support educators in their tasks so that we get great children out. And we're pleased to be a part of that. And thank you very much for convening today.
Thank you, Donald.
First, thanks to CER for pulling this forum together. And thanks to the audience for the very engaging questions. And I'd like to applaud the kids who are in the back.
Thank you all very much. Please, I hope you will not only read, but tweet and Facebook the manifesto. I hope you'll call on us to help you if you are doing a convening, and really give us feedback, both positive and negative, as we go forward. Thanks again for joining us and for staying so long. Appreciate it.